This workshop recording captures what happened in the main Zoom room for each session. What appears in chat or breakout rooms is not captured in the recording. Each participant and viewer comes to the session with a unique lived experience. Anyone may experience unintentional harm from the viewed content or transcript. Please feel free to pause the recording at any time, to walk away from it, or to take time for self-care or processing. When difficult moments occur during a session, further discussion may happen in debriefs or external communications to attempt to repair and care for those involved. What's included in the recording may not represent that additional work. If you feel impacted or harmed by what you experience, please seek out support from your campus or community resources to care for yourself however you need.
All right, well, welcome everybody to this next session of the symposium. If this is your first session of the day, welcome to the symposium. Right now we have Drs. Melissa Kennedy and Jude Bergkamp presenting their session on, what did you just say? Teaching cultural diversity. Look forward to this presentation. I would just like to remind everybody that we would not be direct messaging any of the presenters. We do have an unintentional harm team member here with us today, and they'll be putting their information in the chat. We're also asking if you would use the chat for kudos or sharing, community building. But if you have questions for the presenters, please put them in using the Q&A function, and we will be addressing those questions at the end of their presentation. And thank you all very much for attending.
And thank you, Karen, for facilitating. Jude and I are happy to be here. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Please speak up if for some reason this is not doing what you think I think it should be doing. But otherwise, we're going to get started. I'm going to say again, we're very pleased to be here. It's been a delightful experience to be able to be engaged with the Student Symposium this year and bring our work into dialogue and into discussion with all of you. So we're just happy to be here. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Jude to get started in just a second. I'd also like to acknowledge the work of Natalie Sridhar, who has been a major collaborator with Jude and I on this topic and this presentation. Unfortunately, she's not able to join us today to present, and I know she's missing and sad that she's not able to do so, but we just want to acknowledge her contribution as we get started here. And I'm going to go ahead and turn it over and let Jude just jump right in and get started with this topic.
Melissa, I think your captions are showing if you want to move them off to a different screen.
I so do. That is exactly what I wanted someone to tell me. We're going to swap display. How's that look? Is that looking better?
We're getting your presenter screen now.
Oh, okay.
I think you might just want to go to your more button of your Zoom bar and hide captions. Or you can drag.
I'm sorry. I didn't mention. I left the captions on purpose for closed captioning.
Okay, everyone can turn them on or turn them off if they want in their Zoom browser so that you don't have to do that on behalf of everyone.
Oh, I think I missed that tech meeting that told me I could do that. Will it stay on the recording though if I leave it on closed caption?
The recording will allow people to turn it on and off as needed.
All right, then we'll take that away.
Okay. Well, hi everyone. I'm Jude. So today, basically, I don't know who here has tried to teach a course on what could be called diversity, multiculturalism, cultural competence, social justice. Maybe some of you have been asked to facilitate a training on it. And maybe some of you have taken these classes, as most kind of degrees in human services require, usually by accreditors, a class like this. And most workplaces also require some kind of training around this. So really, this presentation is it's definitely not our polished solution. It's more of the results of, for me at least, over 25 years of trying to teach these classes and really messing up. and really struggling. And this is really chunky and crunchy, if you will, this whole idea. And so today, I'm really going to just share with, and Melissa too, share with all of you kind of what is the best kind of theory of pedagogy and guiding concepts that we've come up with so far to guide us in this work. This presentation is really taken from a manuscript of a chapter that's currently in submission and will hopefully be published. So please keep your eye out for that. But that's kind of what this is. For me personally, I can say that I have been, again, doing these trainings and teachings for most of my career. For the last 13 years, I've been teaching these courses at the doctoral level here at our PsyD program in Seattle. What I'll get into a little bit later is that while I do have this status as a faculty member and as chair, I have these roles that have some power related to them. I also have what we call a target rank as a person of color. And that dichotomy or interaction between status and rank has caused me quite a bit, to be honest, quite a bit of confusion and hurt. I desperately tried to make this curriculum work, especially for folks in their what we call their agent rank and around privilege. And what I noticed was basically pretty consistently not good course evaluations, kind of hurtful, personalized reactions from students or other participants. And for probably a good decade, I walked away thinking that it was me. There's something about me. I'm not teaching this well. I'm not doing it right. And yet I never stopped holding to certain principles around the idea of making sure that what we're really focusing on here is these ideas about socially conferred privilege and these principles of social justice. So surprisingly, I've taken these kind of liberatory steps to realize that there is a burden upon me that isn't just due to my lack of creativity or teaching prowess, let's say, but more it's kind of the nature of the work itself. Maybe even inevitably that there are going to be moments of crunchiness, of emotional reactivity, of taking things personally, of difficulty in this kind of endeavor. And so it's actually the students of color, my BIPOC students, who have actually helped me see that in a certain way, I'm kind of being a little masochistic in the way that I'm going about things, and that I need to model for our students and other participants resourcing and respecting myself. And so we were really lucky to have Dr. Kennedy join us in our faculty a couple years ago, 3 years ago or so. And during the kind of racial reckoning of the time, her and I spent a very nerdy summer reading everything that Fanon wrote and lots of other things. And out of that came the idea that maybe we should try to do some co-teaching. That her coming in, representing basically kind of being white, but also identifies as a woman, offers some different identity domains to provide some support, if you will, and flexibility in the teaching of this course or these courses. So now, Melissa, I'll hand it over to you for a quick intro.
Sure. Thank you all again for being here, as I said earlier. And, many, many thanks to Jude for just being a great collaborator in not only the courses that we do together, but all of my own growth. We do love reading, talking, and trying to figure out all of these things, all of these very profound and weighty questions. But the last 3 years that Jude and I have taught this class together have been an incredible learning experience for me. And I want to stress, as Jude said, I learn from the students every time we teach a class, every classroom I walk into, and all the courses I teach, I learn an immense amount. And I've learned and grown in my understanding of the social justice, my own privilege, and the work in a way that I hope can be inspiring to the other agents. And we'll be talking about those words in a few minutes in the classroom. And it's an honor to do the work. So yeah, so let's jump into what else we have to say. I'm going to pass it back to Jude.
Thanks, Melissa. All right, next slide. And okay, so yeah, so today basically I'll give a little bit of a framework of terms for folks who were at the last presentation. This might be a touch repetitive or redundant, but I'm hoping, I think they're important enough that we can kind of relearn and learn more each time we hear about them. So we'll be doing some what we call cognitive scaffolding and establish a ground of terms and understanding. Then I'll pass it over to Melissa. She will take us on a journey of the brain, a journey through the frontal lobe, the limbic system, and basically this idea that this course or this topic specifically, very different from any other course that's taught, has the potential and maybe even the inevitability to trigger our limbic system, to take things personally, to need to actually feel misunderstood, and the impulsive need to make sure that other people know who we are, our morals, our values, our intentions. And so how does that work neurologically? And then what can we do in our curriculum development and pedagogy to be able to maybe not prevent that inevitability, but to scaffold it and to benefit from it as best we can? And then after that, I'll talk about some basic kind of principles of how we do our classes and how we kind of anchor the curriculum components that we have. Next slide. All right, great. So for most folks who have been around a while, we have seen the focus of this kind of curriculum: diversity, multiculturalism, cultural competence, social justice, those kinds of things. I'll call it multicultural class for now. But what we've noticed is we've noticed it change. Most of you have probably taken some training or courses in this, especially in psychology. If you might remember, the quintessential book that was used in the required class was the Sue and Sue book. Great book for its time. But if we look back on it now with how things have changed, we realize that the chapters of that book really focused on these culturally different groups: Asian Americans, African Americans, Native Americans. Those were the terms, those were the chapters. They were really about the cultural other, the culturally different other from the clinician or the psychologist. Interestingly enough, there was no chapter, let's say, on white folks or European kinds of folks. And so there was an assumption that basically the whole education was educating the clinician on how to interact and treat the culturally different other. I believe this is still the dominant discourse of our field. We focus on conversations about those who have been oppressed, but we never actually, in Goodman's terms, flipped the coin. So Goodman will say, while it's critical to understand how some groups are disadvantaged by the individual behaviors, institutional policies, and cultural norms, that is only one side of the same coin of oppression. The other side of the coin is understanding how some groups are advantaged. Looking at both sides provides a clear picture of how systemic inequality operates and uncovers more opportunities to intervene and create change. So I want to leave you all with this idea that there are two sides of the coin of oppression. The dominant discourse is for us to talk about those folks who have been oppressed. The challenge for us is actually to flip the coin over. Think about it, it's kind of dark under there. Maybe there's worms and it's dirty. Like it hasn't been flipped for a while. And really focus on how we, let's say as clinicians or faculty or administrators, hold socially conferred privilege. Next slide. So what do we mean by this term, socially conferred privilege? Black and Stone basically are some scholars who really culminated a bunch of different scholarship together and created this basically kind of 5-point definition. So number one, privilege is a special advantage. It is neither common nor universal. Second, or two, it is granted. It is not earned or brought into being by one's individual efforts or talent. Three, privilege is a right or entitlement that is related to a preferred rank. Four, privilege is exercised for the benefit of the recipient and to the exclusion or detriment of the other. Ouch. And finally, five, a privileged rank is often outside of the awareness of the person processing it. So even as you listen to this definition, start to get in touch with how you might feel. What actually might be going on neurologically in your brain? Does some of these ideas that maybe you have socially conferred privilege that you didn't work for and it's not due to your talent, that is conferred by outside, basically historical and colonial and oppressive forces, and that just by you having it, it does result in some exclusion or detriment to the other, that I've noticed has never felt good to folks. I've been trying to teach this idea for decades. I've never seen someone say, yay, that's great. I've always noticed it being kind of a difficult thing, a difficult pill to swallow, if you will. Next slide. One of the kind of anchors of our work is this idea of disconsciousness coined by Dr. Joyce King. She defines this as an uncritical habit of mind that justifies inequality and exploitation by accepting the existing order of things as given. Really, disconsciousness is something that basically is an action. It's not a state of being. Basically, what this means is as we move through life, if we've been exposed to the possibility that we have privilege and someone else does not, then this action of disconsciousness pushes that out of our understanding and our awareness. It prevents us from feeling bad. It's actually our whole society, in a way, according to Dr. King, is actually socially constructed so that those of us with privilege do not have to come to terms or feel or understand or process our own privilege. We walk, the nature of privilege is in a way that we can walk through life without being hit with the truth of basically of oppression. And so the tricky part, the difficult part in these courses is that one of the core goals is possibly to gently, or maybe not so gently, puncture the bubble of disconsciousness. And when that bubble is punctured or gently nudged, most people don't like it. I remember I don't like it either. And so naturally, there's going to be reactions, usually from the participant to the facilitator or the student to the faculty for doing that. It could actually also flip and go the other way around. As Melissa said, we learn so much from our students. Our students could help me pop my disconscious bubble, let's say around my male or able-bodied privilege. It doesn't feel great. Next slide. So other terms that I think are really important for us to think about is this idea of rank versus status. Rank is defined as static and pervasive over context, across context, time, place, and relationship. Rank connotes an identity domain such as maleness or able-bodiedness, usually occurring by the lottery of our birth, which has historical institutional structure and generational forces that have dictated worth, access, safety, ease of volition. Rank determines if we have privilege or the lack thereof. So for me, my rank is my maleness or my able-bodiedness. That does not change from the role I have or the place I am in life. Next slide. We use the terms agent and target rank. These terms refer to the privileged or oppressed aspects of our identity domains. While scholars and authors and all of us might use the terms marginalized, minority, or oppressed as terms for the target, isn't it interesting that it is seldom that there is a clear term to identify how each one of us has privileged ranks as agents? So this idea of defining clearly an agent rank can actually be the move and moment that the disconscious bubble is sort of popped. Next slide. So I hope most of us are familiar with Pamela Hayes' addressing model. Dr. Hayes is an Antiochian through and through, been around in Seattle for like 20 years, so whoop whoop to that. So in her addressing model, it breaks it almost dissects us down into identity domains. When we combine this idea with agent and target rank, then what we see is this is kind of the culmination of what scholars would say are areas of our identity domains in which we either hold agency or we have a target rank. So like I mentioned before, for me, I basically have agent rank all the way down the board, but I am biracial and a brown person, so I do have a target rank as a person of color. Next slide. So status, on the other hand, is dynamic and changing between context, time, place, and relationship. Status can involve interpersonal prejudice and discrimination, as well as the temporary and contextual minority positions, but it is without the historical and institutional underpinnings or gravity that rank has. Next slide. So the one concept that I think we really want to focus on, and I find as kind of mind-blowing a little bit, is the commonness of what we would call status rank conflation. So common terms of status rank conflation could be a white individual who has attended a majority BIPOC high school. They might say, oh, I know what oppression is like because when I was in high school, everybody was BIPOC. I was the only white person. Or someone might say, oh, I work in a field in which I identify as a man and everybody else I'm working with identifies as a woman. So I know what it's like kind of as a minority in that. But isn't it a leap for then that white person to say, I know what racism feels like? Or wouldn't it be a leap if that man says, I know what sexism feels like? But it is actually a very common conflation. It's related to the idea of reverse racism or sexism. For our purposes, what we notice quite often is that there's a very quick status rank conflation when we are teaching these courses. There seems to be an overemphasis on our status power, let's say for Melissa and I, as the faculty. We have that status evaluatory power. But on the flip side, both of us also hold some target ranks, myself as a person of color and Melissa as a woman. Those target ranks don't go away just because we embody this faculty position, right? But instead need to be accounted for. Similarly, I would encourage all of us, when we start to invoke the idea of social justice, that we make sure that we aren't confusing rank with status. While there might be social justice going on, let's say social justice issues going on, let's say in our institution, that there could be issues of status and role power, but don't lose the fact that there is a consistent colonial, historical, and structurally reinforced aspect of our rank going on. Okay, next. All right, so now I will hand it over to Melissa to take us through a journey of the brain.
All right, thanks very much, Jude. The terms are very important, so hopefully you're going to hear us use them throughout the presentation, so that might solidify some of that. And one of the foundations that Jude and I have talked a lot about and we carry into the classroom is this understanding that this whole area is going to be one that is ripe with emotional activation. And we're in an academic environment that we're asking students to use a lot of cognitive functioning to think about all of these things. So we recognize these things are happening. And so we take a look at what we understand now about the brain. So as I always tell my students, what we understand about the brain at this moment in time is hopefully, with any luck, not what we understand about the brain in another 20 years or 50 years, but what we understand right now. And as we talk about this, I want us to acknowledge together that neuroscience at this point in time has a very limited understanding of the structures and functions in the brain, but it is also a very limited field. And we want to take a moment to recognize the coloniality of neuroscience today. And we want to acknowledge the limitations in talking about any of these neuroscientific ideas. What we see with neuroscience research pretty consistently is that they fail to report anything around social location of their participants who this research is being done with. We don't know where and who some of these individuals are. And this is coming out of an assumption in the neurosciences that all bodies work the same and that the structures and functions of the brain work the same. It doesn't matter if you're a woman or a man. It doesn't matter if you're Black or white, if you have some type of target rank, or if you hold only agent ranks. The assumption in the neurosciences is that the brains work the same. And we'd like to see that this understudying that has happened with folks that are neurodiverse, for example. Neurodiverse individuals have not been studied well in the neurosciences because the tools to study the brain that we have currently don't work well for people who can't tolerate a lack of movement or who can't maybe tolerate an enclosed space. The requirements of the mechanisms to study aren't sufficient. And this holds for BIPOC individuals as well. We understand that melanin and hair type will interfere or stop whole bodies of groups of people from being studied. So we recognize that there are methodological concerns in the neuroscience, but it is what we have. It's our understanding in the moment. So I'm going to speak from that place of our understanding in the moment with a recognition of the limits of that understanding. The key things that I'm going to talk about as far as the brain goes is two aspects, the adaptive nature and the interdependence within the brain itself. And this extends to the whole body, right? And the interdependence piece is what I'll speak about first for a minute. And as neuroscience has developed over time, we've come to see that the brain works in a network. The brain doesn't work in isolation. There's not one little part of your brain that turns on when you have an emotional moment. There's not a place in your brain that you feel sad and something lights up. It doesn't work that way. It is a very interwoven, interdependent kind of brain. And what we're going to talk about a lot today is emotional activation. And when we look at the emotional activation in the human brain as we understand it, we have these structures, and a lot of us have heard the term, oh, that's the amygdala, the fear center of the brain, or maybe you've heard somebody talk about the other subcortical structures, such as the anterior cingulate cortex, and how that in the amygdala trigger our fear response. But that does not happen in isolation in the brain. So these emotional systems are at play, but so are things like the prefrontal cortex, the frontal lobes of the brain that are helping to regulate those emotions, or in some cases, accelerate those emotions. The brainstem, how aroused we are, how activated our brains are in any given moment, is all part of an interactive emotional activation network. So we want to stress this interdependence in the brain and take that out from just these brain structures to understanding what our bodies are doing on a larger somatic kind of level. And what we see and Dr. Tima this morning mentioned interoception, which is this internal monitoring of our organs and our bodies. It's part of our sympathetic nervous system, if you're familiar with that term. And this interoception or this awareness of our bodies and what's happening within us. Am I short of breath? Am I nervous? Are my hands clammy? These physical manifestations of these internal responses to environment are happening, and these interact with exteroception. So we've got interoception happening within the body and exteroception happening as our bodies try to work with this incoming environment and stimuli. So walking on campus, walking into a classroom, sitting down with your peers as students, there's a lot of internal things going on happening inside, and there's this external stimuli and environmental stimuli, and these two things are woven together, and they impact all aspects: our cognition, our affect, our behavior. And so these things are working together, this communication between the internal and external kinds of systems. And when we see and we think about emotional activation, one thing that has been, I would say, fairly solidified in a wide array of research over the years has been the fact that this early childhood is the time in which we lay down this emotional activation. That in early childhood, we learn how to adjust and adapt and regulate emotions, or we do not. And there are many factors that come into play. And these emotion activation responses continue throughout adolescence into adulthood. Our emotional activation systems are always engaged on one level or another. And we recognize these early life events, these early life stressors impact our self-regulation and that ability to integrate our senses and our understanding. So keeping this in mind, we want to be able to recognize that our students, our participants in our DEI class, as well as our colleagues sitting in a faculty meeting together or a faculty senate meeting together, or any space we come together as individuals, we are all bringing this level of emotional activation into play. And what is going to activate us and how we're going to respond is a mix of our history, our personal understandings, interacting with the environment. And as such, we understand that the brain is an adaptive organ, and it adapts, but it also has this deep history that it's rooted in. And part of the activation of the brain is to predict. Part of what the brain needs to do is predict. What do I do next? What's coming next? What is this professor going to say? How am I going to respond to that? What is the student over here going to say to me? How am I going to respond in these times? And this prediction element, regulated in a subcortical part of the brain called the insula, predicts and optimizes for survival. So when we're talking adaptive, we're talking about survival and the ability of all of us as an organism in the world to survive. And our predictions and our responses are always working, and they're trying to manage our executive control, to hold ourselves together, to appear professional as we give a presentation, or to present in front of a classroom, or to speak out in class and raise your hand and give a response. So we've got executive control that our brains are trying to manage. And we also have this emotional salience, this emotional body that is always moving, always reacting to the environment around us. And where I'm going to get to, and even more strongly in a minute, is to recognize that when we feel threatened, our responses may overwhelm. My ability to emotionally regulate is going to be in part driven by whether or not I feel threatened. And those pieces of threat matter. And what we see is that when I'm not able to choose to move into a more cognitive functioning place, I'm being driven by my emotional reaction. What happens is my systems turn on and I can move into a place of flooding. And changing and reaching back to a homeostasis can take us some time to do. So as I go forward, I want to talk about our tactical and adaptive strategies when we move into a place of emotional activation. So when we're in a threat response state, we move into these states of arousal. And in the field of psychology, there's been a big emphasis recently and an expansion of research into this idea of somaticization, how we carry things in our bodies, our somatic responses, and we're coming to understand these better. But what we want to stress here in our presentation today is that these are emotionally based responses that have developed over the lifespan, have been intended to help us survive, and that we are going to be responding to danger when we notice it. And so the reality is that there is emotion in the classroom when we're teaching these classes. When we teach multicultural classes, if we want to go with that name, what we're talking about is something in which the participants in that class may, for their own reasons and in their own ways, move into threat responses, and that we need to keep a handle and an awareness of these emotional reactions that may be overwhelming these cognitive functions at any given point in time. So we habituate, and each individual, and I use some of this in my therapeutic work, each of us as individuals have these ways that we've adapted and that we respond to threat. Some folks will flee. We've had students in class, the conversation turns to something, they're flooded, their emotion reaction, and they flee, they'll get up. They'll have to go to the bathroom, or maybe they just really need to get out of the space for a minute and get out into the hall. And we see that fleeing reaction. Some students will move into a flight kind of response, and they'll move towards the threat, and they'll engage, and maybe they'll challenge the person speaking. They'll push back instead of moving aside. Sometimes we'll see a fawning kind of behavior. This can be this very obsequious kind of behavior of, oh, yes, turning things into, it's all okay, putting a smile on my face, kind of maybe turning away, not engaging, not pushing, right? And sometimes, and this often will be seen in the classroom, and we might not notice this, so I want you all to be aware that folks will move into a freeze response in some cases, right? Again, these are all different possible reactions that people have, but the freezing, we think of it as tonic immobility. The person shuts down and they can't move and they're not thinking. Maybe this is a student that looks down and you notice they just stop moving for a few minutes. They're dissociating, they're freezing, they're having this very emotional reaction to a topic, an idea, something that's been said in the classroom. And all of these habitual ways of responding interact with releases of our stress hormones. So our brains have, and our bodies have a bit of redundancy in some ways. And as we hit a threat response, we move into a release of stress hormones that are happening at the same time these other responses are happening. And these stress responses flood the body with cortisol, corticotropin, a whole bunch of stuff. But what's happening, the body is going to strive to return to homeostasis. But if we're very activated, that might take some time. It might take minutes. For some students, it might take hours or even days to start to feel that they're in a place where they can regulate and allow something else to come into their awareness besides that threat response and that emotional activation. And so we want to stress what we understand and hold really closely in our work is that when we're talking about topics of oppression and when we're talking about privilege and the privileges that we hold, threat responses will be activated. They're going to be replayed. They're going to be replayed in classrooms based on that person's life, right? And this brings us to this overwhelming need for us to hold on to this idea of a developmental stance and this neuroscience of emotional activation, and that the responses we see in the classroom are emotional responses to threatening material. So as we move and think about this, we're going to talk about some privileges, awareness barriers, these things that come up that get in the way of us as you know, as instructors or as professors and our students these barriers to understanding their privilege and being able to discuss it and be in a space where this is talked about. And one of these we want to stress is emotionality. And I know that's kind of what I've just been saying for the past, I don't know, probably too many minutes, but several minutes about this emotion activation. And the typical multicultural classroom curriculum often starts out with asking students to share their experiences, public statements of this, or a sharing of target and rank kinds of experiences. And we're going to get into this more. Jude is going to talk about this in a few minutes. But in recognizing this emotionality, we recognize that starting with this place is not necessarily going to be helpful and is going to introduce a lot of emotionality. Even this year, one of our students in class, when we started talking in our first of the two series about a historical colonial perspective, students are like, well, when we thought about social justice, we think about talking about oppression. And we say, we're going to get there, but we're not going to get there yet. Okay, because we understand that what we offer in the second course in our series is the privilege awareness. We give them some base before, and we'll talk more about that. I don't want to get into that, but we know when we hit the point of being able to talk about privilege awareness, that what we're doing is we're threatening students' identity. And so privilege awareness, we give the students a little form to fill out, right? It seems like a very cognitive exercise. Take it down, right? List all your target and agent ranks. This is not, however, strictly a cognitive exercise. It is a threat to identity. And identifying our privilege and where we hold that privilege, as Jude said earlier, we're threatening students' identity. And as instructors, we need to bring awareness to this emotional threat so that we can prevent the threat as best we are able to. We will never be able to do that completely. And so that we can support our students. Okay, I'm going to move on and turn this over to Jude to talk about the next aspect.
Thank you, Melissa. Appreciate it. So again, let's replant ourselves in a way in this idea of maybe we're we're giving a training, teaching a class on this sort of stuff, or we are participants in it. We could even think about what happens just when we have conversations in our daily lives about things like racism or sexism. What is almost inevitable, it seems, is that it's going to set off that limbic system or identity threat and all of these neurological sorts of habituation that we have, as Melissa was saying. So what is a way to deal with that? How do we kind of structure that training or class in order to maybe not prevent it, but to cultivate that process? The other thing, just quickly to mention, is how different the experience will be when the same topics are coming up or the same activities are happening in class, but how different the experience will be for those folks in the room in their agent ranks or their target ranks. In other presentations, we've talked about a little bit the fallacy of this idea of safe space. And so one of the main concepts that we really anchor our effort on is to understand that for those students, let's say, in their target ranks, Melissa and I need to be very mindful and careful as to not recapitulate a same sort of oppressive harm that happens for these folks in that target rank all the time. So we are concerned in a way about harm reduction, if you will, for students in their target rank. But for students in their agent rank, this idea is really more something about comfort or discomfort. Sorry, Melissa, you're emitting hearts through your hands. It's really, it's totally cool. It kind of worked with what I was doing. Anyway, so in those agent ranks, when we're kind of popping the bubble of disconsciousness, then what we think about is more about, is it comfortable or not comfortable? And like Melissa was mentioning, is it a threat to their identity? What folks will notice is, usually for us, if we're talking about these things and we don't have certain structures around us what will inevitably happen is that we will feel we'll feel our identity is threatened. We might feel mischaracterized. And the move that we make is want to kind of prove how we are not racist or we are not sexist. We want to double down on making sure people know what our morals and our values are. And so this can get into a kind of a sticky, stuck point in which everyone is sort of comparing how their target ranks to each other, how oppressed they are to each other, sometimes what we call the woke, not woke Olympics, if you will. So the next couple slides are ways that we make sure to try to scaffold and structure our curriculum. The first one is something that we just did a little earlier. I went through these terms. I talked about status versus rank, agent versus target, disconsciousness, socially conferred privilege. Those are all ways in which we are creating a cognitive framework, a place in which we all agree on what the terms mean. And when we are triggered off, we can still use similar terms and conceptual models, and we can at least plant ourselves to a common understanding. This can be very important in these because if you don't, folks will start using terms, but they're going to be understood in distinctly and drastically different ways for those of us in our agent or our target ranks. So in other words, this kind of scaffolded learning with a shared framework can provide guardrails or guide rails as the emotional roller coaster of DEI discussions progress. All right, next slide. One of the biggest kind of stretch that we've done, and I think is kind of very unique and different from most other curriculum that we've looked at, is to make sure that we ground everything in a historical basis, to define what is the colonial historical ground that we all share. If we don't capture the history that we all share, basically the conversations turn into kind of who's good and who's bad, who's woke and who's not, who's racist and who's not, those sorts of things. But for us, we usually use things like the Howard Zinn book about history of peoples, or right now we're using Wilkerson and Caste, but we're spending time before we get into interpersonal sharing or even kind of the dissection of our identities through agent and target ranks and privilege. Before we do any of that, we really set up a foundation of history, starting to understand where we all are from and what the gravity of historical colonization now has on our contemporary colonial mindset. This doesn't mean that all of us are the same, but what it does mean is actually the students are very quick to pick up that we all share the same colonial ground, but the manifestation of that is drastically different for those of us in our agent or target ranks. This also allows for a different theory of etiology. This also says that maybe oppression isn't just confined to an interpersonal interaction. Maybe oppression is not just due to people being terrible in their nature, but that oppression is actually a giant historical ghost in our lives that wreaks havoc for everyone. The difference is that coloniality that's baked into systems and institutions then grants some folks privilege and actually enacts for some folks daily and terrible oppression. All right, next slide. We also make sure, and this is kind of difficult in clinical psych because it's a very kind of sometimes restricted field. We need to make sure that everything is evidence-based and scientifically minded in those things, as most of us know, Western science is in itself a colonial structure, which will allow only some things in and will definitely serve as a gatekeeping function to keep some things out. So Melissa and I will have to take risks in our curriculum development. We risk actually including these powerful theories and ideas that have been historically on the margins of clinical psychology. We make sure to bring in these marginalized voices and kind of decenter the colonial mindset. We call into question clearly through history what coloniality and the colonial mindset is. And then we try our best to offer what scholars have asserted as alternative and different ways of thinking and being. These can come from liberation psychology, these theories that can talk directly to our target ranks. This can come from critical consciousness, critical race theory, which allows for a really sophisticated interrogation of our agent ranks. This can also go to this idea of intersectionality. If we stay true and loyal to the term, that intersectionality is really about the exponential impacts when we hold simultaneously two target ranks. We also look here at the interaction between our agent and target ranks. If someone doesn't have any target ranks at all, which we would call a super agent, we hold those folks gently, because here it comes, the disconscious bubble popping is going to be a little rough. But we try our best to find some sort of reference points so that they can start to interrogate their own socially conferred privilege without necessarily having who they are as a person threatened in a way. All of these do not mean that we are innately letting those with agent ranks off the hook, but we do have to exercise a sort of agent compassion. And so that brings me to the next slide, please. The other major kind of philosophical perspective that we take, which is housed and loyal to clinical psychology, is the developmental model. The idea here is that within each of our agent and target ranks, we could be at a different developmental place. For me, as far as my male privilege, that agent rank, I feel like I have done some work to start to become aware and understanding what that privilege is and how it is damaging to other people. Please don't ask my partner and wife about that, because she might say something different. While on the flip side, I'm almost 50. I grew up in Kansas. And so this domain around me being a cisgender male, that is somewhat of a new concept for me. I know that developmentally, I am not that advanced and I have a lot of work to do. So in that way, I need to be careful about what's going on and make sure to keep vigilant about that identity domain. Both of these ultimately mean that, well, let me ask it in a different way. I'm sure all of you know an interaction that you've had, even with a family member or loved one, in which they might say something that comes off quite racist or sexist. So if we didn't do a developmental model, if we didn't apply that perspective, then we might just say, oh, that person is terrible. They're thinking terrible thoughts. They're a terrible person. We need to fix that. And what we might do is try to yank them from where they are to where we are, thus cultivating this kind of real polarity and debate. Sometimes that might just be needed because they're hurting other people and things are harmful. But in a developmental perspective, remember, we can't demand a baby who's crawling to all of a sudden start running. We need to move in a developmental way. Those of us who might consider ourselves as woke had to inevitably be at some time not woke. And we really want to make sure we understand what that process was from us not being aware of our privilege to now being aware of our privilege, and how have we changed our lifestyle, our behaviors, our identity, our theories of how much we've accomplished, how we embody our agent ranks, how we embody our status power, we need to be able to articulate our own development over time in order to, in a certain way, join with those who are in a less developmental place and help with humility move those folks forward. All right, next slide. All right, great.
I'll take this one. So one of the things that when Jude and I enter the classroom, we recognize the need and the reality of having all eyes upon us. And we come to this place of educator disclosure. What do we share? How do we share it? And a key part of my role in the classroom comes out of my whiteness, right? As a white woman in the classroom. In our program, the majority of our students are white female students, not all of them, but many of them. And the ability to represent and show up as who I am on my own journey, as I struggle myself, as I acknowledge my privilege, as I acknowledge these things, this matters, and it offers this possibility to model what we're expecting our students to do. So I strive when I go in, and as I know Jude does in his ways as well, to present often with a sense of authenticity, to present authentically, to acknowledge my mistakes, to acknowledge my missteps and the ways in which I might offend, or the ways in which my statements might be seen as racist. I have to acknowledge when I make those mistakes, when I step into a space that I don't intellectually want to be in, but my own disconsciousness is showing. We have to come to these as educators from a place of humility and a place of learning, of lifelong learning. And that's another thing we hope our students gain, is this ability to be a lifelong learner. We seek to bring in consistency and transparency in this work. And so with these disclosures, we do this in a very meaningful, thoughtful way. And we recognize that these disclosures may in some ways present harm to ourselves in our target ranks. They may be very difficult. We may push aside our target rank feelings and emotions in order to try to educate in a way that feels more performative or feels more in keeping with a colonial style expectation. But the reality is when we bring this authentically into the classroom, we make a difference in what and how our students can learn. And this brings me to a really important piece, and Jude mentioned this a little bit earlier when he was talking, is this idea of safe spaces. Is the classroom a safe space? And when we talk about disclosure, we come to this other barrier and this piece. And as we've already said and tried to stress to you today, privilege discussions, awareness discussions, oppression discussions are activating on an emotional level. And one of the things that we've observed over time is often agents in a space. So this may be white students in a space that also holds BIPOC students. This may be a white faculty. It may bring in and co-opt the space as they struggle in their privilege awareness. So as a white student, for example, may struggle to recognize that they are not in their place in our classroom solely because of their own merit. For example, meritocracy is a myth that bursts that bubble of disconsciousness. And so as a student sits there and understands that their life has been full of privilege granted to them because of their whiteness, they feel an identity threat. They have this emotional reaction. And so we talk about keeping that space safe for everyone. And this precludes the reality of the situation that for BIPOC folks and people in their target ranks, there is no safe space. I hold, and I think that we talk about this in a way that understands that the safe space term dismisses the reality that spaces are not safe in academia for BIPOC individuals. They are not safe spaces or for people in target ranks. These target ranks might be their gender presentation, whatever their target is, they are not going to find a safe space. And this is a reflection of society as a whole. We understand that these spaces are inherently violent and re-traumatizing for both educators and learners of color and in their folks in their target ranks, that these environments are not safe. So this idea conflates this concept of agent comfort. We should all be comfortable. And as DEI or multicultural professors and teachers, and we move in with a naive assumption that everyone is on the same playing field and everyone can feel safe, that their emotional reactions that we've talked about so much today won't be activated because they're in a safe space that we are telling them is safe for everyone to have whatever feelings they have. But do we really recognize that? And we hold, and one of the pieces of research we're working on in our lab right now is looking at this reality of what is psychological safety. And we find this to be incredibly colonial. Oh, sorry, my voice went out. Colonial in nature, right? So psychological safety, the absence of interpersonal fear, much like I said about neuroscience earlier, it dismisses privilege and the recognition of discomfort being a learning mechanism and not a place of risk for many, many of our students. So the safe space conceptualization recognizes something that is not real. It attempts to reify and create some space that's not real. And so what do we ask of our students, and what do we do in our agent ranks when we are holding those? We might feel uncomfortable. I may feel very awkward to face the reality of my whiteness. But as I do that, I am only discomforted. I can walk away. I can stop thinking about my whiteness. I can go have lunch with my friend, and I can not pay attention to it. I can resume a place of disconsciousness, but a target in that same space, if I'm in a space where I'm feeling the weight of sexism, for example, I don't shake that quickly. It stays with me. It stays with me. I have to work through it. I have to process it, right? So what we ask of our students in their agent ranks is to not co-opt space. Instead, we ask our agent students and participants to self-regulate, to leave the space respectfully, not necessarily fleeing, but to recognize their own awareness that they're dysregulating because they're feeling discomfort, and to leave the space if they need to. But we ask them to not center themselves, because we have this habit and place of waiting to center. And what is at the center in these dark spaces, in these spaces that are not truly safe? And targets often walk into classrooms in waiting to be tokenized, waiting to represent their group, whatever that group looks like, asking to share painful memories, to become a token for something. And we have to be able to recognize that our targets may need to be dressing up their qualifications in order to feel safe in a space, to try to level a playing field. We see and we watch, and we've watched this in class many times, where agents will weaponize their emotions. And that concept of white women's tears that center the space around that journey of privilege awareness or identity threat decreases what air and space is left for the target populations in my room. Finally, this is something that happens, and this is kind of a concept that I've already spoken about a little bit, and this is this idea of agent to agent communication. So in the classroom, I'm doing agent to agent communication when I'm able to regulate and to communicate directly with students and say, this is hard to recognize and do, but we can manage it. We can handle it. We can learn to regulate, and I can assist those white students in that agency, right? But I have to do that in a way that doesn't co-opt the space and threaten the experience of the target in the room. What we are seeking, and Jude, I think, mentioned this earlier, is a harm reduction kind of way, where we're looking for the target not to bear the responsibility of comforting their agent peer. Okay, I think we're really running out of time. So Jude, you've got, I think we're just don't have really, but a couple of minutes. So can you speak quickly to the faculty burden?
I sure can. Thank you, Melissa. So again, just for everyone to recall that idea of status rank conflation, here is this idea that even though Melissa and I hold this status power as faculty. Both of us hold different target ranks and different agent ranks. And so the microaggressions, the kind of macroaggressions, if you will, that are almost inevitable when we start to challenge the colonial disconsciousness of all of us, then you're naturally going to get these emotional reactions. You're going to get some kind of hostility. And the issue is they can go ahead and question naturally the status power issue. But what we want to make sure of for our own sustainability as faculty and as facilitators is to not put our target ranks on the line, not have ourselves be too exposed to that kind of aggression that's almost inevitable when we start learning about privilege. And so in this way, Melissa and I have been working somewhat clumsily, and it's a lot of work, by the way, to co-teach, to work together in class. So when whiteness comes up and there's a white person who's had their disconscious bubble kind of pop and they're struggling, then is it best for me to be the one to start working with those folks when inevitably in their kind of habitual limbic flinging around, they could kind of hurt for me as a person of color? They might be saying some things that are implicitly racist or something like that. So when it comes to that kind of white flailing, then maybe I can tag out and Melissa can take on the whiteness, agent to agent, and it eases my target faculty burden. On the flip side, if there's someone in which there's a lot of sexism going on and this idea around that agent rank is being triggered, that would be a time for me to tag Melissa out and for me to step in and start working with that person on their privilege awareness in a compassionate but firm and developmental sort of way. So with both of those, it's just to say, and folks who were at the last talk around the BIPOC faculty burden, this is a real phenomenon that has not been quantified or honored. And so it's weird for us to say to all of you as faculty and facilitators of this kind of work, you need to take care of yourselves and you need to make sure that your target ranks are not getting further harmed through this work.
Thanks, Jude. All right, we're going to move in. We made it to our Q&A slide with just a few minutes to spare. I am going to go ahead and put this up for just a minute. I'll take it down in a minute. This QR code leads to our lab website, and you can see more about the work that Jude and I do with our students in our decolonial and social privilege awareness lab. So I'll leave that up for a minute, but we're welcoming your questions in the chat. So the Q&A function, I'm sorry, we agreed on the Q&A.
Yep. So we have one question. I want to thank you, Melissa and Jude, for this presentation. Here's your question. Have you ever had a BIPOC student challenge the idea that their identities are target identities? I recently met a Black man who reported he'd never experienced racism and railed on the woke ideology of identity politics. I started to debate and then reflected on what would be the benefit of convincing this person that he's experienced racism. Can you speak to the benefits of training BIPOC students and clients of their marginalization?
Yeah, I can take this one. So in the presentation, remember that for us, our focus in these classes is actually to flip the coin of oppression to privilege and really focus on ourselves in our agent ranks, as that's where the potential we all have for inadvertent harm comes from, especially in a high status role, let's say as a psychologist. So I would be focusing on agent ranks. If this individual, let's say, was in class and that we do this kind of social location mapping, and we're we're introducing a model that says, okay, so in that agent rank, scholars would say you might be, or in that identity domain in race, you might be a target. And they have their reaction. Nothing about that reaction is particularly the focus of my class. And however someone in their target rank or a BIPOC person needs to find a way to define themselves against all of the colonial oppression that they live with every day, find some way to survive. That is not the kind of move that I'm going to make in that point in time. What I will do developmentally is actually try to gently start to move to any other ranks in that addressing model, let's say, that you would say you might have some privilege in. There's almost inevitably one. Let's say national origin, citizenship privilege. We can even start to just focus on basic laws and rights that certain folks have, certain folks don't have. But either way, I would pivot and move from that. I would not be threatening much in any way. I'm not here to push someone to push forward in their own liberation. That needs to come in their own time, in their own volition. Me doing that could simply recapitulate the colonial oppression that is probably at the root of that reaction.
Thank you. So we have another comment for you to respond to. I'm curious how you talk with students about the safe space fiction idea in the context of a class.
So I'll say something and Jude may want to add to it. I think that part of this is acknowledging in the classroom, in the space, that we all bring and will have emotional reactions that are based and grounded in our life experience, that there will be times when people are not safe, and that both Jude and I prioritize not co-opting the space for agents, right? So we focus on making sure that the targets in the room are not taking care of the agents in the room. And we talk about this directly, and we will talk directly about the need for agents to leave the space, for the agents to self-regulate, with the understanding that we can do that with compassion and a developmental perspective that says, hey, we know you're growing and learning and changing, and we're going to do that together. But there are going to be times when you're uncomfortable, and not to conflate that discomfort with real fear and threat that others might feel in the room, other targets may feel in the room. Jude, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, absolutely. So this also reiterates the importance of a historical contextualization and cognitive scaffolding of terms. If we didn't introduce and work with this idea of agent and target ranks, if we didn't introduce the colonial history that is outside of all of our control, but we were born into, and thus we were conferred privilege, and then now the responsibility to embody that privilege in the way that causes the least amount of harm. If we don't do that, then there's a guise of equality. And I believe that under the guise of equality, what you'll notice is when the disconscious bubble is popped, we all, I bet all of us have done this. We all want to basically co-opt these terms like safe spaces or liberation or these kinds of terms that are not for us in our agent ranks. Those are sacred, or even intersectionality. These are sacred terms and concepts for those folks in target ranks. So for me, so again, this moves to status rank conflation again. Let's say if I'm in a place where I'm, working with mostly women, and somehow I say, I don't feel safe here, I'm guessing most women in our Zoom session would kind of roll their eyes and be like, give me a break, buddy. Because so in the context, that person may not feel safe, But what we do is we provide a gentle, compassionate developmental model of social privilege awareness that helps folks identify where they're at now and what's the next natural developmental stage they need to be at. When we also scaffold that with the neurological aspects that Melissa had talked about, then we're also saying, those of you in your agent ranks, you do have the responsibility to regulate yourself in the classroom and outside of the classroom as to not burden folks in their target rank. None of this would be possible without cognitive scaffolding and a historical foundation.
Great. Thank you both so much. I don't see other questions right now. We have like 2 minutes before the end. I don't know if folks want to put in a question or if you just want to have some closing comments.